So the majority of Americans are unhappy with the American healthcare system, and this is due to the fact that they're not presented with the full spectrum of options for treatment because of either unwillingness by providers or insurers or legislative preventions. Which brings me to my major claim that physician-assisted suicide has a positive impact on the American healthcare system, resulting from the benefits that insurance companies receive, the restored trust in the healthcare system, and in the ability for physicians to provide their full care. So insurance companies benefit because continuous care for patients is no longer needed with physician-assisted suicide. These days, patients tend to live longer, but they have more pain. So opted suicide ends any pain and further potential harm. And then since there's no longer continuous care that is required, there's less cost that's put onto the insurance companies. In Sweden, where physician-assisted suicide is legal, they did a study and found that roughly $627 million in medical expenditures a year is saved due to physician-assisted suicide. And then on top of that, the expenses of temporary extending the lives would be reduced. So physician-assisted suicide is actually only legal if the person has 6 months or less to live. So extending their life for that 6 months would cutting their life that 6 months would cut the costs on insurance companies. My second claim is that trust in the healthcare system would increase. When patients have the ability to actually choose their care, they tend to trust their physicians more. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, there was actually, according to the 14th Amendment, patients can choose to be protected and have their freedom and liberty protected as well. So that means that if they choose to die, then they have the freedom to do that. And there was also a court case, Cruzan versus the director of Mississippi Health, where it was determined that individuals have a right to refuse artificial medical provisions of life, meaning that if they were sick enough and they didn't want to go on any longer, they could refuse food, water, or respiration machines. And so if they have the ability to refuse this, they would be in more pain than they would be if they were to just go with physician-assisted suicide. And then lastly, it aids the physicians in fulfilling their duty to care for patients. So when doctors first become doctors, when they graduate from med school, they all have to take the Hippocratic Oath. And in that oath, it's different everywhere, but technically a universal thing is that they have to promise to care for their patients as fully as they can. And so if they are allowed to assist in suicide, then they would be, rather than extending the life of someone who's in pain, they would be fulfilling those patients' wishes and the care that they choose. And then on top of that, people already have a living will, which means that if they were in a coma or something, and they already signed a will that says, at this point, like, you can stop care for me. So physicians would be able to actually talk to their patients and stop care when they choose. So overall, physician-assisted suicide would be more beneficial for insurance companies. It would restore trust in the healthcare system altogether, and it would allow physicians to provide full care for their patients. Thank you.
All right, you identify the proposition. I think it's a little bit awkwardly phrased. In the end, though, when you say it has a positive impact, I think you need to specify a little bit more about the impact that it has. It sounds like the 3 points that you present, that is the supporting structure, but it sounds like you've got them in the proposition as opposed to a separate series of claims that you're previewing for. So that was just a little awkward. Ultimately, though, it's relatively clear, so it's not a big problem. You signpost those points as you get to them. The idea that it's going to be beneficial to the insurance company, I think that there's probably not a lot of dispute about that. The insurance company would love to not have to pay for the last 6 months of treatment of people's lives, and they'd be more than happy to pay the inexpensive cost of whatever medications are required to terminate a life early. I think there might be an argument, though, that suggests that that kind of pressure is going to result in a duty to die rather than a desire to die early, and that'll probably be the main response that the refutation speaker presents. And there's not really any discussion of what the context in which these desire to die is. There's a presupposition that people are automatically suffering, and I don't think that you document that. I think that it's an assumption as opposed to something that is proven. On the trust issue, the notion that doctors are going to be trusted more because the patients have control, that's an interesting idea, but your proof on this is an argument about the 14th Amendment and a case in Mississippi where apparently somebody sued for the right to end treatment. I don't know that anybody has denied the right to end treatment since that court ruling establishes that right. So the question now becomes, is there an obligation of physicians to provide suicide assistance? That's a slightly different claim, and there's not really any court ruling on that issue that you're citing here, and I'm still not sure how that enhances the trust of the patient with the doctor. That seems like it's a strange leap of faith to be making on that particular point. And then on the last point where you're saying we're allowing doctors to fulfill their duty, you use the example of living wills, and again, we're back to the same kind of issue where there is a difference between not requiring people to take an action and requiring people to take an action. And it seems to me like physician-assisted suicide is requiring the doctors to take an action. In other words, this is a thing that you now have to provide to your patients because that'll be part of what is acceptable. And I think that there's going to be criticism about that as a potential problem. I think the evidence that you cite is really not very strong. You've got a lot of hypothetical examples. The clearest information that you have is the research on the first point that talks about cost savings in Sweden. Of course, those cost savings are not to insurance companies per se, but rather to the government, since they have government-funded health care in that system, which I think is an interesting comparison, but I'm not sure what the long-term savings are going to be. And believe me, $627 million would be a lot of money to me, but when we're talking about the whole healthcare system, I'm not exactly sure it's a huge chunk of change. I think that would be one of those things that somebody would probably put into a context. All right, thank you very much. That appears to have